Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we're doing tonight chapter 12 of this marvelous book, The Essence of Self-Realization, the Wisdom of Paramhansa Yogananda, and wisdom it is indeed. We've been working progressively from the beginning of the book, and although this was a collection of sayings that Swami Kriyananda put together, I mean, he gathered them from many sources over many years and then collected them into categories. He made a very consistent pattern for this book so that step by step we're sort of learning about the nature of life and how to live it. So I know I've summarized every week sometimes sort of where we've been and where we're going, but it's an important aspect of the spiritual path to realize how one thing leads to another. And that we end up with I used to give a class that I love myself. Sorry, I have to be enthusiastic about the things I myself do. I called it How the World Works and Why. I think I liked that title so much because that was the question I had all the years before I came onto the spiritual path. I could not figure out how the world worked, and I couldn't figure out why. And what the spiritual path gave me was just exactly that. Like, what's going on here? What is the purpose behind it? And then a further step, which I learned after that, which was what to do about it. That particular class was just the preliminary, but a lot of this book has been sort of how the world works, the law of life, one reality to all spiritual truth. Sin is merely ignorance of what the truth is. Reincarnation, karma, working out karma. The chapter just before this one is called Grace versus self-effort. And of course, once we understand the balance between how God acts in this world and what we can do to be in tune with that grace, that really leads us to the need for yoga. Of course, nowadays, this enormous, fantastic, amazing interest in Hatha yoga, on one hand, it's a great step, in the right direction. On the other hand, it's just utterly confused the waters because Hatha yoga is a physical exercise. It's a subtle physical exercise, and it's marvelous that people have gotten involved in it because it does also lead to deeper things. But it's very important to understand that yoga is not Hatha yoga. Hatha yoga is actually this hair-thin thread that's just been pulled out of the whole science of yoga because we have such an interest in our physical bodies in this particular age. And Hatha yoga is the supreme method for working with your physical body. But yoga is really the science of how to unify our limited consciousness, or how to liberate our limited consciousness from its bondage and free it to go into its natural state, which is infinite and which is divine. And Hatha yoga, insofar as it is part of that science at all, is how to harmonize the body, how to keep it healthy, so that you can transcend it, not so that you can perfect it. Because really physical perfection is quite an unattainable dream, because the physical body dies. In the end, it just turns to ash no matter what. And it ages along the way. Certainly, right diet, right care of the body, and Hatha yoga can keep it youthful longer. But nonetheless, when we're thinking in the realm of eternity, the care and feeding of one body is meaningful only in that the human body is a privilege and has the potential to be able to experience infinity. From within a physical body, the nervous system is sophisticated enough that we can have a perception of the infinite. That's all that unused gray matter in our brain that science can't figure out what to do with. So, so let me just try to think. Oh yes. So what we're working with in the need for yoga in this first entry that Master has here is an extremely interesting one, because what he's talking about, and this is again the whole issue of Hatha yoga versus true union, is that the reason even though we have the potential, even as we exist in this physical body, to see behind the seeming reality of matter to the power of spirit behind it, we tend not to perceive it. We tend to see the world as a physical thing, allow that input to come in through the senses, and we just take it as the given. Because our energy is so accustomed to just being drawn out of us, propelled out of us almost by this attracting force of Maya that's all around us. The nature of the physical body is that it looks outward. From the time the little baby is born, it's looking outward. Whereas the truth of our nature is looking inward. But just to decide to look inward does not in itself make it possible. I think I've shared with you the story of being in a taxi cab. I believe it was Chicago or perhaps New York. And somebody asked me what I was doing. I think it was Chicago. And I was there to give some programs. And my short answer when people ask what I do is I say I teach meditation. Because it's interesting enough that if the person really wants to know more, they can ask me a question. It's short enough that I don't really have to explain the whole story of my life. So I said to this man that I teach meditation, this taxi driver. And he said, as he's driving his taxi through the city, "Oh, I tried that once, didn't work." I said, "So what did you do?" "Oh, I went into a dark room and I sat there, nothing happened." I said, "Well, that's why I teach it, because there's a little more that you could do." But in fact, he was giving us a true experience, and not so different even for aspiring yogis, which is that it's just not so easy. It's not so easy. We have incarnations of habit, and we have the whole inclination of the physical body to go outward. So it's a real science to learn how to take all that energy that's being used, it's being, well, dissipated is actually the right word, to gather it in, to bring it to the center of our being, which is to say in the spine, and then raise it up the spine and concentrate it at the spiritual eye through which that perception can take place, and even the perception of the infinite. And then, even to operate the physical body, to continue to operate the physical body in the physical world, but guided from that expanded perception rather than just compelled by our lower chakras or by sort of an unthinking rhythm of karma that's just taking us without our even knowing where we're going. So what's so interesting about the science of yoga, extremely interesting about the science of yoga, is that it really is not, it doesn't belong to anyone. It doesn't belong to any religion. It doesn't belong to any culture. Yes, it's true that India has specialized in the science of yoga. In fact, Master calls it yoga is the backbone of the greatness of India. But it has made India great. India has not made yoga great. India's devotion to yoga has made what's made India a great country. In India, they call this entire science, which can also be called the science of self-realization, the Indian word for it is Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana Dharma is a magnificent phrase, and like many phrases in Sanskrit, there's no true Indian equivalent, English equivalent. But Sanatana Dharma can be translated either as eternal religion, or my favorite definition that I've heard is that which is. And I like that because yoga is that which is. It's not a dogma, it's not a belief, it's not if you adhere to this, then you will be saved, or anything like that. It's the way we're made, and it's discoverable. Yes, the sages and the scriptures explain it to us, but the sages discovered it because of the compelling energy of individuals to understand how the world works and why, and what you can do about it. In Assisi, Italy, when they were building their temple, so we're having, pausing a moment. When we were building a temple in Assisi, Italy, they had a desire to make a replica of the spiritual eye in blown glass. And the spiritual eye is the golden ring with the deep blue field and the star in the center. And the man who was in charge of that project, Arjuna, and I believe he was also with Narya, who's another devotee in Italy, And they were in Rome, and they were in the area where there were glass blowers. And they had the intuition to go into this particular shop. And they started talking to the man there, who was an artisan. He wasn't a devotee. He knew nothing about yoga. He didn't have any idea, what the symbol meant. He'd never heard of it. But they started describing to him what they wanted. And they drew it, or they showed him a picture. And when he heard the description, he said, I often see that when I'm sitting quietly with my eyes closed. He said, what is it? There it was. It's because it's the way that we're made. So what yoga does, in fact, the very definition of yoga is described in the Bhagavad Gita, is starting with what is and then working with what we are to refine it and to bring it to a higher and more elevated level. And Master talks here in this particular entry, it's really interesting. He talks about many Christian saints have discovered aspects of the spiritual path that are intrinsic in the teaching of yoga. And then he goes on to enumerate them. They had raised their energy from body attachment to soul identity. From defining ourselves and imagining ourselves merely to be a material being, to understanding that we are a force of consciousness and energy that is neither born nor dies. They had discovered the secret of directing the heart's feeling upward in devotion to the brain instead of letting it go outward in what he calls restless emotions. Because the most unsettling, the element within us that ties us most strongly to attachment and involvement in this world is in fact the likes and dislikes of the heart, the desires, the attachments, all of the elements. I have to stop if you're going to do this. So are we not getting the recording we need?
I said it was clear for a second, and then back to fuzz. Just unplug and replug.
The only reason we're doing this is for the recording, so if it doesn't work, I'm not even going to bother. Well, that was a huge noise. Was that where that noise was coming from?
No, it's just the computer fan.
Oh, okay. I suppose I have to talk before you know whether it's buzzing or not.
Noticing both your mics are facing down. If maybe it goes face up, because they're saying they have low volume aside from the static.
No reason to activate that other microphone. And none of these are put on here properly. Is that correct? I can't see it. Okay. If they weren't put together, these microphones are a mess. Could we please make a note to do this, to do something about this before the next time? We have a better choice than this. Now what? Are we buzzing or are we fine?
I have a note from Jitendra saying great.
Okay.
It's all great now.
Okay. Let's try to find something of where we were. Master was enumerating the ways in which the Christian saints, and what he ends up describing here is he describes the essence of what it means to redirect your energy. So he talks about letting your feeling go upward in devotion rather than outward in restlessness. They have discovered that the point between the eyebrows is the doorway to spiritual understanding. The Bible says, if thine eye be single, thy whole body will be full of light. But that's not really explained, at least not in the Bible as we see it. In fact, when Dr. Lewis met Paramhansa Yogananda, Dr. Lewis was Yogananda's first disciple in America. That's the question he asked. He said, I've asked so many, what does the single eye mean? And Master told him exactly what it meant. It meant that the two eyes that look out and see the duality of the world are literally drawn upward to this chakra, and that duality unites in the oneness of spirit. And so great saints who have great devotion suddenly discover that this is where their energy goes. When you have great devotion for the spirit, this is where that energy concentrates, because it's not a dogma, it's the way that we're made. And if you really think about it, whenever you're really trying to concentrate on something, you often put your attention right here, because this is also where the brain is. And you'll see when people are inspired, your eyes go up. When you're feeling inspired or trying to draw energy from a higher place, you tend to look up looking for it. It's just automatic. They've discovered that breathlessness is a characteristic of divine inspiration, because the breath itself also is the connecting link between the divine realities and the human realities. And the breath itself is a point of concentration that will actually take us from the material to the spiritual. And when we become deep enough in our spiritual understanding, first in our spiritual experience in the moment, first the breath slows, and then it will actually stop altogether. I mean, there's nothing in Western spiritual literature that explains all of this the way it does in yoga. But what Master is explaining is that those who go deep in the spirit discover Sanatana Dharma. They simply discover that which is. And then he describes mystical marriage, which is definitely a very Christian concept, a Christian vocabulary concept, in which union takes place, in which one realizes that the small self is in fact united with the infinite self. And when you read Christian mystical literature with an understanding of yoga, it's so apparent how we are describing that which is. This is the real unifying power. This is what will bring about the oneness of all religions. Yogananda put it that self-realization has come to unite all religions, not unite them under the banner of one teaching or one master at all, but self-realization itself is the unifying reality behind. It's not a question of tolerance and this kind of broad-minded respect for, well, we believe this and you believe that and we believe that you can believe whatever you want. It's really understanding that in the end, all of us are doing exactly the same thing, which is we are withdrawing our energy from our identification and self-definition as external material beings, and realizing that there is this thread of eternity that runs through us. And when we redirect our energy, the quality of our consciousness is united with the infinite. I read something that I enjoyed so much recently. It was about a Swami. His name is Purushothamananda. He's passed away now, but he was a very great yogi who lived in India. I only knew of him, I didn't know him. And a group of Western scientists came over to India, and they wanted to do tests on the brain waves of meditating yogis. And so this is a true story. So this Swami Purushothamananda was a very famous yogi, and so this university scientific crew heard about him, and they wanted to come in. They were going to attach him up to all these machines and read his brain waves. And so he agreed, and they said they wanted to come on a certain day, on a Monday, let's say. And he said that day is not going to be convenient. Well, they said, well, given their schedule, it was really the day they had to do it. So the yogi said, okay. So they came, and none of their machines worked, none of them. They weren't able to do anything at all. So they came back the next day, which is the day the yogi had suggested they come. And they hooked him all up, and then they were trying to test him, but he had no brainwaves at all, none. And so they were kind of all alarmed, and he saw their consternation. And then he said to them, "Oh, you want brainwaves," he said. So then their machines just went haywire. He just had brainwaves of every possible description in no possible order, just going in every direction. And then he had no brainwaves at all again. And after it was done, he just turned and he just looked at them and he said, "You know nothing about the mind." And that was that. For some reason, that story tickles me so much. I just sort of can see the yogi, the scientists obviously had some karma because they were getting the darshan of a very great saint, and he was trying to teach them something. But you see, we study from the outside, whereas the real understanding comes from turning the attention inward. And you don't do that, though, you see, until you're hungry. That's the whole point. And later in this section, Master talks about the power of love. Because love is really what moves us toward this. Nothing can happen without that. I'll go there in just a moment. And what we also have to understand that is our real faith in God, our real faith even in whatever religion we practice, if that's how if that's how we're constituted, if the articulation or the culture or the ceremony of one particular faith attracts us. Maybe we were born into it. Maybe the pageantry or the music or the spiritual family feels like ours. But the real power of whatever spiritual path we follow, whatever we call it, has to come because we have turned our attention inward through the practice of yoga, whether we call it that or not, because the Christian mystics discover the same principles, and actually experienced that this isn't just a theory or somebody else's explanation, but this is really who I am and how I'm constituted. And that, again, is also the unifying reality of self-realization, which is that all spiritual paths, all true spiritual paths, because people make up all sorts of stuff and call it religion, but we're talking about those spiritual paths that were the revelation of an avatar, the revelation of a great master. They all have to do with the expansion of consciousness, and that's where the unifying comes in. We all understand that we separate ourselves from our limited identity and we embrace a greater identity. And that leads, of course, to a commitment to helping others, to compassion, to unconditional love, to nobility of spirit, to honorable, everything that we think of as spiritual values or even elevated human values, all have their origin in the idea that our limited identity is an illusion and that our expanded identity is the greater truth. And in order to be loyal to that greater truth, then these behaviors are obvious. And that's one of the ways you can tell a true religion from a false one, because expansion of consciousness leads to a shared experience. Swamiji, even though he's very creative, he was also, as he put it, very orthodox, which is he said that it wasn't his own opinion he was depending on. He was depending always on the testimony of Scripture and the testimony of those whose authority he trusted. I read something interesting recently, just in a little note of Swami's that I had. He was explaining, actually it was in a talk that he gave, but I don't know what talk it was. He was explaining what he'd explained many times, which is why it was so radical for him to become a disciple. This was from when he was 22. He was a very strong-minded, Swami Kriyananda as a young man, was very strong-minded, extremely gifted, brilliant, and therefore quite apart from the crowd. And up until the time that he read Autobiography of a Yogi, he never imagined that he could or should take anyone as his teacher. And he said there were two reasons for it. First was he never met anybody who could teach him anything of what he really wanted to know, which is how the world works and why, and what to do about it. The nature of reality, the nature of God, the nature of infinity. Truth was what he was looking for, and he met many intelligent and talented people, but none of them could assert with that unmistakable authority that they had penetrated to the heart of reality. None would even pretend to do so. And I'm thinking again of Dr. Lewis when he first met Master, and he asked Master, you know, the spiritual eye of spirit, once he understood what it was, can you show me? Can you show me how to go into that spiritual world? And Master said, yes, I can. Just nothing, not maybe I might try. Yes, I can. And Master himself talks about his meeting with Sri Yukteswar, and his first meeting with Sri Yukteswar, and his demand of his guru, that his guru take him all the way to God realization. And he wanted Sri Yukteswar to promise that to him. And ultimately Sri Yukteswar did, because he could make that promise. And that's a very important point. Swamiji remarked that sometimes people say, and in fact, well, sometimes even in Master's name, people say, if you do these certain things, then you will have the blessings of the Masters. Swami said they have no right to promise that. They can't promise that. Only Master himself can promise that. And that's really true. So Swamiji was saying that prior to the time he read Autobiography of a Yogi, he'd never met anybody he felt could teach him. And it wasn't arrogance, it was just the truth. He couldn't teach him this. And secondly, it was more subtle but interesting to me. He said that he was so committed to the search for truth, which he knew was an internal reality, that he felt the very integrity of that search for truth demanded that you do it yourself. And so he couldn't even imagine the idea of how you could disciple yourself to someone, because it was your search. But then he picked up Autobiography of a Yogi, and there was one more step in that. Despite his philosophical commitment to the idea that he could do this on his own, it wasn't working. And that's just an enormous aspect of things. Recently, in a completely different context, I was having a conversation with people. We generally talk about Ananda being based on two principles, which is where there is Dharma, there is victory. And the second is that people are more important than things, meaning that you don't try to fit people into your projects, you make your projects for the people. And the people's welfare, spiritual welfare, is always the primary and only concern. No other consideration matters, because a spiritual organization is there for the spiritual welfare of the people. So those are the two that we always speak of. But there's actually a third principle to Ananda, and it was one that Master gave to Swamiji, and that was, you have to be practical in your idealism, which is, you cannot merely insist that this must be true because I want it to be true. Or you can't say, this is what it must mean, this is what it is. You have to always be appropriately adjusting to what's trying to happen, to reality as you see it, to the capabilities of the people around you. A Master himself, you see, when he incarnates, he has the same infinite potential, but he has to be practical in his idealism. He can only give what people will take. It's as simple as that. So Swamiji hadn't yet met Master or learned that principle, but there he was with this idea that the integrity of seeking truth demands that I must do it myself. And that's the kind of ideal that you like. You know, a person can be very inspired by that. But Swami was discovering that it wasn't working, because he didn't have the capacity to enlighten himself. And he wasn't wise enough to be able to discern among the options or whatever it was. So he had to be practical in his idealism. And when he picked up Autobiography of a Yogi, and he realized that he was in contact through that book an infinite consciousness, with a person, a living person, who was a channel for exactly what Swamiji wanted to attain, he didn't hold to his theory. He became very practical in that idealism. And he immediately went, and the first words he spoke to Master were, "I want to be your disciple." Discipleship, you see, is a principle of yoga, and it's a principle of Sanatana Dharma, which is that which is that the ego cannot liberate itself. The mind cannot enlighten itself. We must have an influx of power channeled to us through the medium of one who knows. This is a part of the story of grace versus self-effort. And we have to just see what is happening. And this is what every true seeker discovers at a certain point, that you reach the limits of your own ability. And when the disciple is ready, the master comes. Swamiji often said, when people would ask him, "Do I have to have a guru?" And Swami would say, "Not if you don't think so." Which is to say, if you don't believe that you have a guru, no, you won't have a guru. That doesn't mean that you'll be able to liberate yourself without one. It just means that you don't know yet that you need one. And it's pointless for me to tell you, because merely telling you won't convince you. You'll hold on to whatever principle you have until it ceases to serve you. So, Master is also defending here the necessity for these techniques, and this is what the masters do teach us. There are things you can do to help yourself. And he says often the bhakti yoga, the one who's really going greatly by feeling, feels that the practice of techniques will distract one from that pure love. But what Master again is pointing out to us is try it and see what happens. I mean, there is a great upliftment in a great fervor of feeling, but as Master said, you can stir up the feelings in an outward way, but sooner or later all that energy has to come down back again into perfect silence. Swamiji talked very sweetly once about the movie South Pacific, which is a very beautiful movie, and it's a very sweet love story. And he talked about a particular moment in that movie when the woman and the man, it being a love story, suddenly realized that there was a great love between them. And in the way the film is done, that moment of realization comes into a moment of silence. And there's just that moment of perfect stillness when they realize that this is going to happen. And Swami was always touched by that. He enjoyed a noble love story. He was not a romantic, and he was not impressed by trivial, self-seeking, selfish love stories, but where there was an element of nobility. It's always inspiring to see nobility, whether human or divine. Noble love is noble love. But he said even in that movie they sort of threw it away. They didn't know what to do with it. But in the divine life, artistically they didn't know what to do with it. In the divine life, there comes the point where no matter how fervent our chanting and our prayers and our singing, dancing for God may have been, that there's a deeper level still where we withdraw the energy. We withdraw the energy from all that outward expression. That outward expression is a way of working with what is, and instead of letting that outward expression dissipate in worldliness, we at least use it in divine focus. But once that energy has begun to be generated, sooner or later we have to bring it back in to quietness. And the way Master puts it, which is so sweet, he said in any relationship with anyone, you don't want to do all the talking. You also want to stop, and you want to listen. You want to have offered what you have to offer, and then you want to wait and sense how it is received. And our relationship with the divine is, every subtle nuance of the life that we know refined and refined and refined and brought to its apex of potential. And so the silence of meditation, and not merely the quieting of ourselves or the shutting off of ourselves, but the silence of meditation is bringing everything to stillness. So it isn't just that there's no noise, there's no inner noise either. There's no agitated feelings, eventually there's no breath, there's no casting about in many directions, there's no multiple levels of involvement with the world. All of the energy is brought to a focus at this point. And that's where technique comes in. How do you do that? Like the taxi driver, I tried it. I sat in the dark and it didn't work. I tried to bring my attention here, but it kept going through all the other vrittis in my chakras and all sorts of other directions. So Master teaches us, breathing, how to concentrate on the breath, how to hear the Om vibration, ultimately how to do Kriya. And what Kriya does exactly is it circulates energy through the chakras, and it just gathers all that energy. It creates magnetism at the center, which in itself draws our energy from outward focus to a stronger focus in the center of our being. We circulate that energy so that the magnetism of that increases, and what we're doing constantly is we're drawing all the energy from the lower chakras to a concentrated point here. That's what technique is. It gathers the energy and it focuses it. It interiorizes it, it elevates it, then it focuses it. And then what happens is, it's not at all mechanical. We're using our energy all the time, concentrating on all kinds of things, and suddenly when we bring that to a more dynamic focus, then we just perceive a reality we haven't seen before because we weren't looking for it. Or we were creating so much agitation. There's a story in Autobiography of a Yogi where Sri Yukteswar comes to see his guru, Lahiri Mahashaya. And when he comes into the inner room where Lahiri is sitting, Lahiri says to Sri Yukteswar, "Did you see Babaji standing in the anteroom?" And Sri Yukteswar said, "No." And why? And later on, he's talking to Babaji, but Babaji says to Sri Yukteswar, "Your mind was so restless, you didn't see me hiding behind a sunbeam." I love that thought, that if your mind is subtle enough, you could see the form of the master through the sunbeam. But Sri Yukteswar's mind wasn't subtle enough, so Babaji was able to hide behind a sunbeam. Now, that's a pretty subtle level, but still it's a beautiful thought, that even we can just see right through everything. We're so still that all the vibrations of the universe stop. You see, the universe is vibrating. That's why we have this illusion of the material world, and that vibration creates magnetism which pulls us out. But when we completely still, and I'm talking of very high level, so we just take ourselves toward this, the more we can still our inner vibrations, the more you see it puts us in tune with a different level of vibration, and we actually merge right into that. It's wonderful. Okay, let's see what else we have here. There's also another very important aspect of this that we have to think about. Because why are techniques necessary? Can a person simply flow with the inspiration he feels? That's something that everybody always has to come to an understanding of. This is grace and self-effort also. And this is, again, being practical in your idealism and being able to accept reality for what it is. The universe that we live in is not neutral. Let me think how to say that. I mean, we are being drawn. There are two forces at all times. It's not like we can just sit still and then float in one direction. There's a very powerful force that is really always pulling us away from the light. And it isn't just that, well, yes, it is, that we have this constant outward focus, but we're tempted. We have this impression that our happiness lies in all these other things. I was reading today something that Swami said in a satsang he gave to a group of monks and nuns many years ago. And he was talking about, the benefits of the renunciate lifestyle. He was talking to renunciates, so he was talking to them about the benefit. He can also talk about it from the other side, but this was a very interesting point. He said, when you live alone, when you have people around you all the time, when you live in a family and you're always associating with other people, he said, it's harder to remember the dream nature of this world. He says, when you live alone and other people's realities are just that little bit removed from you, it's just easier to be aware of the fact that, this force is a little bit distant from you. Now, bear in mind, marriage is appropriate for most people, and it's not like one is better than the other, they're just different. But he said, when people are a little more distant from you, it's easier to recognize that that you don't have to embrace their reality so completely. And then he said something that was fascinating to me. He said, when you're with someone or people all the time, he said, little irritations and fulfillments, he said, have a more insistent hold on the mind. I thought that was a very interesting way to put it. If you're always there and having the sweetness of the interaction of your friendship, for example, this is not just about being frustrated, it's also about being fulfilled, that the constant repetition and the constant intimacy of that experience insinuates itself in your mind in a very powerful way. If you live alone, even if occasionally those longings come to you, they don't intrude themselves upon you with the same kind of force. Isn't that interesting? Now, don't think that the answer to that then is, if you find yourself in a family situation, that you should try to live like a monk. That's not really the wholesome way to do it. You have to go through that experience, but I'm not talking about that right now. I'm talking about the fact that we are constantly being pulled into deeper identification with our individuality, with our limited individuality. And if we just do nothing to counter that, it will simply take us over. It will take us over for incarnation after incarnation after incarnation. Even when we get on the spiritual path, many people, just do it for a while, and then their energy runs out. So it's no safe guarantee just to sort of sign on the dotted line and become a member and then just consider it done, because it's not a dogma. It's an actual experience. And one of the reasons for technique is that if we don't commit ourselves with a powerful force of our will to redirect our energy in one direction, it will simply be drawn in the other direction. I mean, look at people as they age. You just see their energy just gets pulled down and pulled down and pulled down. I don't just mean the natural aging process which happens, but how many people, become more and more free, lighter, more beautiful, happier, wiser, more virtuous in all of the ways that really count, more conscious of God as the years go by? Very few. It has to be a deliberate effort of will, and it has to be an effort that's renewed every day. And one of the things that renews that effort is the satisfaction of the results that effort brings. When you begin to see in your own life that by these practices you become somebody else. And the transforming power, it's a total transformation. I was reflecting today, a little bit bittersweetly, I have to admit, that one of the shortcomings of my life, for certainly three-quarters of my life, I would say, three-quarters of my spiritual life, is that I didn't really, how can I say it? In a certain sense, I want to say I didn't believe in the transformation, or to put it differently, I didn't have sufficient faith that if I simply persevered it would work, to not be afraid of afraid. And so that anxiety plagued me. and made me impatient with myself and impatient also with others, because I also didn't understand how transformation would happen for anyone. And I mistakenly thought impatience would help. And by contrast, of course, I hope I'm making this clear, because by contrast, you see, Swami Kriyananda absolutely understood the transforming power of the spiritual path. And he was never impatient. He just knew that if he just stuck with us and we stuck with him, and we all just continued day after day to put our energy forward, there was no cause for discouragement. There was no reason to be alarmed. There was no reason for anxiety. We just would, if we just persevered, that it was inherent in the practices. It wasn't inherent in just sitting in the ashram. As Master said, lots of rats and mice lived in the Mount Washington Canyon, but they weren't making spiritual progress. As I say, it wasn't automatic. But if we persisted in the right way, it was inevitable, because the teachings work. And I was thinking, well, let me just digress with this beautiful story. This is a vignette out of a movie that I saw, which was otherwise completely forgettable, because I don't even know what the name of the movie was. But this little moment had so much power for me. It was a very long movie, much longer than it needed to be, and it was about the last remnant of some Indian tribe that was being, just horribly pursued by the terrible white people and ultimately annihilated. And they took about 2.5 hours to do it. And one of the sub-themes was this elder Indian, this elder chief, and as part of the movie, every so often he would have this vision of this island. And it was just sort of always in the background of his thinking. And in their long saga trying to escape annihilation, eventually they actually come to that physical island, and he looks across a river and there it is. And then as soon as he sees it physically, and given the circumstances, he says to whoever's younger people are around him, that he realizes that vision was the vision of his death place. And that he'd had that vision ever since he was young, and if he had understood that it was his death place, then he would realize that death could not come to him until he was on that island. And he responded by saying somewhat regretfully, if I had only understood what a brave warrior I would have been. Because you see, he would have known that nothing could kill him, because unless he was on that island, he wasn't going to die. Now, reflecting on what I was thinking about today, about having this really deep faith in God and Guru's transforming power, and the power of Kriya and the power of the practices and serving the Guru and everything, is to say, why would there ever be any anxiety? What a brave devotee I could be. What a confident, joyous devotee I could be. Because why would there be the slightest cause for concern? I am the disciple of a great master, practicing his teaching, serving his work. What could possibly ever upset my equanimity? But I look back on my life, and I'm not trying to emphasize regret too much. I don't want to. I'm trying to do something else. If I had understood intuitively, and I did to a certain extent, because never for a moment did I think of quitting. But there was more fear than there should have been. And I was saying to myself today, next time, because I presume there'll be a next time, I hope I'm born into a family of yogis and never have a moment when I don't know about this truth. But next time, be a very brave warrior. Because you know if you persevere, it will succeed. Just like the Gita promises Arjuna, what if I try and I don't make it? Krishna says, well, you just pick up where you left off. My devotee is never lost. In the next incarnation, you will move forward into success is absolutely guaranteed. And this is what we have to understand on the spiritual path, that it really does work. And all we have to do is just keep doing it, and we become so different. It's not just age, it's transformation. Just qualities that we absolutely thought would be with us forever aren't, because they aren't us. We redirect our energy from identification with this limited self, and we become identified with this infinite self, and everything changes. Swamiji says in this context, he said, the hardest thing though on the spiritual path is to know what the right thing to do is, and to want to do it. It's not even as if one has a desire not to do the right thing, but just not be capable of doing it. Just have there be too many conflicting vrittis. I had this picture once, and it because I've watched people sort of set an intention and then end up over here. I've watched myself set an intention and end up over here, and I realized what it is that deep inside your heart, where you begin, you send your energy out, and your intention is to send it out in a straight line, or send it up and out in a straight line. But there are all these vrittis. And so you think you're sending it in a straight line, and it actually gets sucked over by a vritti and goes over here. And this is the challenge of the spiritual path, to know what the right thing is, to intend to do it, and find that you're just not capable of doing it. So I mean, it was interesting. I think he said that's the hardest thing about the path. And then he added, and then when that happens, not to justify it, not to try to self-justify it, not to make any excuses, but just to have it be what it is. Just except that he said, it takes years to get to that point. You know, this path is very much more subtle than we think. It isn't just a question of, oh, I'll just snap my fingers, and that's why we have to have. That's why I was realizing today that was a very important quality that I didn't have, which is the faith to have patience and to not be afraid, to be a very, very brave warrior because of the vision that I know where I'm going. I'm reminded in that context of the story that Swami would often tell about the master who was sitting with disciples, and disciples were asking, when will I find God? And the Guru was saying, in 5 lifetimes, in 10 lifetimes, in 2 lifetimes. And then a devotee asked, when will I find God? And he said, in your case it will take 1,000,000 lifetimes before you do. And all the other disciples were so horrified for him. And they realized that he had left the satsang and was somewhere else. And they thought he'd gone away in despair. But then they realized he was dancing in ecstasy outside the room. And when the other disciples went to commiserate him, he said, brothers, rejoice with me. The Master has said, that in 1,000,000 lifetimes I'll be realized. And they said, 1,000,000 lifetimes, because they were so horrified. He said, yes. He said, what is 1,000,000 lifetimes? Because the Master has said, I will be realized. I will find God. And then the Guru came out and in that moment touched the devotee, and he was liberated in that moment. And the Guru said, I just wanted to show you what a true devotee looks like. You see, that kind of faith. Just what does it matter? Because I know that the end result of this will be my spiritual freedom. So what a brave warrior I can be. Over and over again, that promise has been given to us, but we don't quite receive it, do we? We don't quite take it in. But when we do take it in, think how different everything would be. And what cause would there be for fear, ever? Anxiety, discouragement. Swamiji also said, I was reading today, Satan's way is to discourage us. Discouragement is one of Satan's best tools. And what the Master always has hope for us. No matter how much the Master may correct us, no matter how much we may feel that we're being corrected by the Master, by the events that are happening around us, whatever it might be, or whether he's speaking to us directly, he always speaks to us in such a way that the hope is always there. There's just the hope is always there. Swamiji said when Master would correct them, he would be very, sometimes, strong. But then he would always say, now don't think about it, just don't think about it anymore. Now focus on where you're going, just let it go. But Satan tells us that we have to focus on it. Satan tells us that we have to be discouraged. Satan tells us that, there is no hope for us. But we have to counter that with the Master's promise. If you persevere to the end, if you just don't quit, if you keep up, the teachings will work. And it's very important then, in the Bible it says true love casts out all fear. And fear of failure is, of course, a very big fear that haunts everyone at one time or another. But love is really the power that moves us forward. And love is the greatest technique. If we want to talk about redirecting our lives, the devotion, it's the devotion of the Christian mystics who did not have yoga to help them, to guide them as explicitly as the yogis of India do, but they had great love. And that great love, when you greatly love, then all of your energy is redirected. What the techniques of yoga do is that they help you, when you have that great love, they help you to move that energy more harmoniously, more powerfully, more effectively. But even as Sri Yukteswar said, you really can't put one foot in front of the other unless you have devotion, because you see, love makes you hungry. Love is what makes you want to do it. You have to love something. You can love truth, you can love freedom, you can love the Guru, you can love Jesus, you can love the light. But love is a feeling from the heart that compels you forward. Love happiness, love bliss, but something compels you forward. The heart has to become engaged. And when the heart loves more and more deeply, then automatically that energy is liberated. It is the power of love that allows us to master ourselves, isn't it? I mean, the most magnificent example always is the love of a mother or father for the child. I mean, the degree of self-sacrifice that love induces effortlessly. I mean, and in fact, there's some beautiful legends of the child consuming the parent, which doesn't sound like a beautiful legend when you say it, but in fact that is a symbolic representation. Once the parents have given birth to this child, everything about their life has to be dedicated to the survival and the ultimate raising and success of that child. The parent itself in its own reality ceases to exist. That's why Swamiji in our Nayaswami order, even though you can be you can be married to be in it, you have to wait to become a Tyagi or a Nayaswami until you are not raising children. As Swamiji put it, because you don't have the karmic freedom to make such a decision. Your karma has to be secondary to the karma of your child. You have to be in a position to facilitate the karma of that child. And the other thing he said, which was interesting, he said the relationship between a parent and a child must be more personal than is appropriate for a true renunciate. And now, that's a many-leveled statement, but for that reason he put into the Nayaswami conditions that while you're raising children you may be a pilgrim, but you can't be either a Tyagi or a Nayaswami until that duty is done. Until the child is an adult or a young adult at least. Otherwise, because you have to give that child the warmth of a unique relationship, of uniquely knowing. You have to make that child feel that he's unique in your life. You can't treat him impersonally as a renunciate would treat everyone in the world. Everyone is my brother and sister in the same way. The way householder dharma is taught to you, the techniques of yoga for householder dharma, is that you see God personified. There's lots of stories of the baby Krishna and the mother Yashoda. So if you're a mother raising a child, you become Yashoda and make your baby Krishna. So even though you are devoting everything to that unique individual, you see that unique individual as a manifestation to you of God Himself. And so the sacrifice is sanctified rather than binding you to a limited reality. it tunes you in ever more deeply to an expanded reality. Wherever we are, that's always the potential. We always have the choice between allowing ourselves to be pulled backwards. You see, this is the need for techniques. Just habit is this tremendous force. Past life experience is this tremendous force. All of those vrittis in the chakras, it's a tremendous force. We're just always drawn by habit and by those vrittis just into the same old way of doing things. And then always here, I mean, as if they were on two sides of us. There's this power of the light inviting us. And we're caught in the middle. You know, we're caught between our faith in the promise of the masters that even if it's 1,000,000 lifetimes, we will be freed. And when we are freed, it is for eternity, and those millions of lifetimes there is nothing. And all the habit of just following the path of least resistance. This is the need for technique. We need to build within ourselves, just like you go to the gym to build up your physical muscles, or go to the hatha yoga mat to build up your strength and your flexibility. We have to constantly, every day, train our soul, train our consciousness to be attuned with our soul, to do those things that all the masters and all the scriptures tell us. Follow this path, and this is the path that leads to freedom. This is the need for yoga. This is the extraordinary blessing of living in a time and living in a place when it's just right there in front of you. If the heart longs for this divine realization, then all doors will open. God bless you.